During the interwar period, Italian manufacturer Fiat produced a legendary line of biplane fighters. These, among a few other designs around the world, represented the zenith of the biplane as a fighting machine. But unlike many other countries, Italy would continue to operate its biplanes for a considerable time. Clear evidence of this was the Fiat Cr.42 Falco, which did not enter service until 1939. The Cr.42 and its predecessor, the Cr.32, are by far the most iconic of the Fiat biplanes, but before we look at these, it's important to understand what came before. By the time the Cr.32 entered service in 1933, Fiat had already produced several other biplane designs, and the two most important of these early models were the Cr.1 and the Cr.20. In the early 1920s, the majority of military aircraft around the world had been developed and built during the First World War. There was a huge surplus following the armistice, and many nations were happy to use their existing stock for a considerable time. It made sense. Most of the public had no taste for further war after the horrors they had just witnessed, and much of the world was now focused on turning the aircraft back into a civil machine rather than a war machine. That being said, there was still development being made in the field of military aviation, albeit at a more conservative pace. One of the exceptions was Italy, a country that had been at the forefront of aerial warfare since before the First World War. The newly formed Regia Aeronautica was keen to maintain a strong lead in this field, and so in 1923 they began a project to develop a brand new fighter. For this, Fiat and SIAI, which would soon become Savoia Marchetti, were approached to submit competing designs, and it was Fiat that would triumph. One of their designers, Celestino Rosatelli, quickly produced two prototypes, known as MM1 and MM2. They were physically similar, except that they both had different variants of the Hispano-Suiza V8 engine, and one had a counterbalanced rudder. Built as a Sesca-plane, Rosatelli's design was uncommon because the lower wing had a greater span than the upper, which made it look like somebody had stuck the wings on upside down. Additionally, the wings were connected by a Warren-style inverted W strut, which again was fairly uncommon in an arrangement. Though it looked odd, it did at least provide a great deal of strength. But aside from this, it was mostly built to the standards of the time. The framework was made from wood, which was covered in fabric. It had a fixed axle undercarriage and a tail skid. It featured an open cockpit, and it had two synchronized 7.7mm machine guns that fired through the propeller arc. Both prototypes appear to have flown in late 1923, though exact dates are unknown. Then, in the following months, they competed against the design submitted by SIAI, outperforming it by a considerable margin. Upon completion of evaluations, the Regia Aeronautica was supremely happy with Fiat's design, and it was ordered into production as the Cr.1. The C standing for Caccia, or Fighter Hunter, and the R standing for Rosatelli, the designer. In 1925, the first two production models were used for service evaluations, where they outpaced the French Nieuport Delage 29, clocking in a top speed of 272 km an hour. That same year, the first production models reached Italian air units, with the total production run of the Cr.1 amounting to approximately 240 to 250 units. Due to the timing of its development, the Cr.1 would never see combat, but they did provide the Regia Aeronautica with a solid platform on which to train their pilots. Throughout the 1920s, the Cr.1 was well liked by its pilots, who praised its easy handling and forgiving nature, and its success won Rosatelli an excellent reputation, both within Fiat and with the Regia Aeronautica itself. During its quiet but successful service life, a few attempts were made to improve the Cr.1 to keep up with other designs that were emerging in the late 1920s. The prototype Cr.2 was actually less powerful than the Cr.1, but it featured an air-cooled Armstrong-Siddeley Lynx. The Cr.5 was far more powerful, boasting the license-built Alfa Romeo Jupiter of 650 horsepower, and the Cr.10 featured Fiat's own engine, the 410 horsepower A20. But by 1926, Fiat was already moving on to the Cr.20, so any attempts to improve the longevity of the Cr.1 were modest at best. Still, the Cr.1 was successful enough that it secured an overseas order from Latvia. Poland and Belgium had also expressed interest, but no orders for them eventuated. 9 Cr.1s were ordered for the Latvian Navy in 1926, and all of them had been delivered by 1927. Equipped with 300 horsepower Hispano-Suiza engines, they remained in Latvian service up until late 1936, being withdrawn from service just a few months before the last of the Italian Cr.1s were also retired. All in all, Fiat's first outing with their biplane fighter had been very successful, but it was clear that the old-school construction of the Cr.1 would limit its service life, and so Rosatelli quickly got to work on a modernised replacement, the Cr.20. This design saw two major changes from the old Cr.1. Firstly, the wing configuration was flipped, with the upper wing now having the greater span, like on most traditional biplanes, and secondly, it featured an all-metal structure. Once again, 2 prototypes were constructed, though it's uncertain as to what the differences between them were. Information on this particular aircraft is pretty thin on the ground, though there seems to be suggestions that each had a slightly different version of the 12-cylinder Fiat A20. In an age where armour protection for the pilot had yet to come about, the armament remained the same. The Cr.20 inherited the twin 7.7mm machine guns of the Cr.1, which once again fired through the propeller arc, though there seems to be evidence that it carried more ammunition. The prototypes completed their first flights in June 1926, and like their predecessor, the performance immediately impressed the officers of the Regia Aeronautica. Fiat's test pilot was so confident that they put the prototype through loops, rolls, Immelmans, and steep dives within just a few hours of flight time. The aircraft was almost immediately ordered into production as the Cr.20, and this time it would see service in a number of different variants. Approximately 250 of the original C20 design would eventually be produced. Though the top speed was almost identical to the Cr.1, the physical endurance of the airframe was superior thanks to its all-metal construction, and it was able to absorb the rough impacts on rudimentary airstrips with greater ease. This was particularly useful during this time, as the Regia Aeronautica was rapidly expanding, and a large number of pilots were relatively inexperienced. To this end, a training version of the Cr.20 was developed, known as the Cr.20B. This was also used as a liaison aircraft, but the exact details of its widespread use throughout the Regia Aeronautica are sketchy at best, and from what I could find, it was built only in small numbers, with a production run of less than 50. Another model that was built in limited numbers was the Cr.20 Idro. It was a floatplane version that entered service at some point in the late 1920s. Though it was still a Fiat design, it appears that all 46 of these were built by Macchi. Additionally, it seems that the floats used in the design were either the precursor for, or perhaps the result of, the 1929 Fiat C29, which was submitted as an entrant to the Schneider Cup, though it would never race. In contrast to the original C20, which handled beautifully, the Idro's handling was once described as vicious. This was mostly because it developed a nasty tendency to stall suddenly and violently when put through certain maneuvers, and it soon became known that putting an Idro through an inverted loop was much like playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded revolver, highly unadvisable. After the original batch of 250 Cr.20s were completed, things then moved on to the Cr.20 Biz. This was a modernised version of the design that featured some minor improvements. The most noticeable was the change to the undercarriage. The fixed axle was deleted, and individual oleo suspension was installed. The Bis also had a slightly reduced wing area and some minor adjustments to the internal structure, mostly to do with reinforcements to the steel framework. This traded a reduction in top speed for better handling and strength, as, according to the pilot's manual, the Cr.20 had a ground-level top speed of 270 km an hour, and the Bis could only manage 250. Attempts to improve this were then made with 2 further variants, the Cr.20 Bis AQ and the Cr.20 ASO. The Cr.20 was identical to the Biz variant, but it was now powered by a 425 horsepower Fiat A25AQ, the AQ standing for Alta Quota, or high output. The Cr.20 Asso was similarly powered by the 450 horsepower Isotta Fraschini Asso, but, in spite of the increased power of both engines, they came at the cost of increased weight and reduced range, and ultimately no real improvement in top speed either. But, despite these final disappointments, the Cr.20 was a well-built, well-handled, and highly popular fighter. Its popularity partly came from its good handling characteristics, but also partly from the remarkably advanced equipment that the Cr.20 came with. To improve the effectiveness of training, the Cr.20s came with a gun camera that was capable of recording up to 1,000 frames a second. Because of this, it came with 30 meters of film, and the system was set into motion by a spring connected to the gun system. Once the film had been used up, a small buzzer would sound to alert the pilot that filming had ceased, after which they would land to review their gunnery. Along with this fairly advanced piece of kit, the Cr.20 also came with a complete electric system, which was charged by a 12-volt Marelli dynamo. The system had two batteries, one that powered the main system, and a secondary one that powered the takeoff and navigation lights on a separate circuit. Other equipment installed showed that pilot safety and comfort were placed high on the priority list when designing the Cr.20, something that wasn't always the case with aircraft designs of the 1920s. The first example was a fully automatic oxygen supply system, which was activated once the aircraft's altitude exceeded 3,000 meters. And the second was a built-in suppression system for engine fires. A loud horn would blare if a fire was detected, though, in an open cockpit aircraft with the engine directly in front of you, I can't imagine a pilot not detecting the fire, but you never know, and the system was then activated by the press of a button. Unfortunately for the pilot, this system used carbon tetrachloride for the suppressing agent, which, for those of you unaware, is a nasty chemical which, when exposed to in high concentrations, such as in a fire-suppressing scenario in an open cockpit aircraft, can affect the central nervous system, lead to degeneration of the liver and kidneys, and, with prolonged exposure, death. Admittedly, this was not common knowledge at the time, and so the system was received favourably by the pilots who would use it. Because of its good handling, relatively high top speed, modern equipment, and semi-helpful/semi-harmful fire suppression system, the Cr.20 not only saw extensive use in Italy, with 32 squadrons operating them by 1933, but also overseas as well. The Cr.20 saw use with the air forces of Austria, Hungary, Lithuania, Poland, Paraguay, and Spain, and, unlike the Cr.1, it would also see combat. With Italy, it saw a brief spate of action during the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. In this theatre, it did not see use as a dedicated fighter, due to a lack of opposing air power, but more as a rudimentary close-air support weapon, mostly striking soft targets such as encampments and supply dumps. This, of course, was limited to gun runs, as the Cr.20 did not have the provision to carry bombs. With Paraguay, the 5 Cr.20s sold to them would be the only fighter aircraft fielded against the Bolivians during the Chaco War. The aerial component of this war is an almost completely forgotten part of history, which is a shame as it was essentially a microcosm of interwar military aviation. Here, Fiat Cr.20s would take part in some of the last biplane versus biplane dogfights, though admittedly in such a sparsely populated combat theatre, the threat of the ground fire was far greater than that of enemy aircraft. In the future, I plan to do a video that covers this small but deeply interesting air war, so keep your eye out for that. Now, the use of the Cr.20 in Spain, particularly during the Civil War, is far more difficult to determine. The biggest reason for this is that by the time of the Civil War, the Cr.20's time had come to an end. It was now being replaced by the first of 2 designs that would represent the golden era of Fiat's biplanes, and this was of course the Cr.32. But that is something we're going to cover in the next video, where we'll take an in-depth look at the Cr.32 and its predecessor, the Cr.30. And then, in a video after that, we will take another in-depth look at the Cr.42 as well. I thought it was easier to do this as a mini-series rather than a giant 2-hour-long video, so hopefully you're looking forward to the next installments as much as I am. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you of course to the patrons, whose names you'll see on the screen here now. Now I'm away for the next 10 or so days, so if another video goes out next week, which I hope it will, but no guarantees, depends on production, I won't have an updated end screen, but if there's any changes to the Patreon list, I'll update that on my return. A big shout out as well to the Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier members. I'm putting the finishing touches on the upcoming airship video, so hopefully you'll get a premiere of that by the end of the month, or maybe the first week of December, depending. But thank you all so much for your continued support, and I'll catch you all next time. Goodbye.